So this is a topic I've been wanting to cover for a while, but I wanted to do a lot of research and kind of think about it in depth before I actually went into it. So we're going to talk about renewable energy, global warming, and like peak resources, all those kind of things, because they're all tied very closely together. Now, the first problem you come across with this is frankly that the whole issue is so politicized. I don't know how factually reliable any of the information you get out of it is. I mean, there's things like the Vietnam War, the Industrial Revolution, World War II, apartheid South Africa, where both sides are just very, very adamant in their position. And the positions are so diametrically opposed, it can be very difficult to kind of shift through and try to figure out what the factual basis is. And that's a big problem you have when you're talking about this topic. Because there's like the pro-nuclear crowd and the anti-nuclear crowd, and they have completely diametrically opposed positions on it, and they're both mutually exclusive. You also will have that on topics like, is it global warming? Is it climate change? Is the world going to blow up in 10 years? Is the world going to blow up in 20 years, in 100 years? Is the whole thing just fake? Is the data just completely manipulated? Are there more storms? Are there fewer storms? Is renewable energy a meme or is it a real thing? Just before we even get into this, I think you have to really keep that in mind. That we really don't have much of an idea on a lot of this. A lot of it just kind of comes down to who you personally want to believe and what nuggets you think you can get by reading kind of between the lines. So let's get into this. Firstly, with regards to global warming, I've for a long time really doubted it. Now, I think the thing to keep in mind is there's multiple types of global warming. There's the common one, which is anthropomorphic global warming. That is that carbon emissions and other chemicals that humans are putting in the atmosphere, as well as the destruction of the environment, is causing the Earth's temperature to rise, which will melt the polar ice caps and a bunch of other stuff, but it'll basically blow the world up. I forget if it was Al Gore, someone said that the oceans were going to boil. Someone said that New York was going to be underwater, and because it had a flood, stuff was going to happen. The Independent in the UK pulled down this article, but I think it was like 15 years ago. They ran an article that we've seen the end of snow. There will never be snow again in the UK. And then there was like a blizzard the next year. And when it turned out the world actually wasn't getting as warm as they thought, they changed the name of it to climate change. So there's two issues I have with kind of climate change, at least anthropomorphic climate change as a theory. The first one is it can't be defined. There's no definable thing. Like, what does climate change mean? There's a website that did a list of everything that's been claimed with regards to climate change. It's like storms increasing, storms decreasing, plants growing bigger, plants growing smaller, rising sea levels, falling sea levels, more blizzards, fewer blizzards. And it's just, they'll have basically anything. So climate change can be basically anything good or bad that happens that fits into the narrative. And I get that in the real world, things are very complicated. There's often multiple factors for something. There's multiple contributions, etc. But I like to think with a lot of theories, like for instance, maybe that birth control causes breast cancer, you could at least do some, that is like a theory. That is, there is a proposed cause and a proposed effect, and you can test it to a certain extent. Or you can do like comparison studies and stuff like that. So that is like an actual theory. The other issue with global warming is it's not falsifiable. Is there anything that could disprove it? No, there's nothing that could disprove it. There's literally like nothing that could or could not happen that could disprove it, because the goalposts keep moving. So when they said like the Earth is going to be underwater in 2010 and it wasn't, they're like, oh, that doesn't mean that we were wrong. It just means we were off by, it's definitely going to be underwater in 10 years. And then it wasn't. And then they just keep moving the goalposts. So it's not falsifiable. So it's a theory that's not, you can't define in any meaningful sense, and it's not falsifiable. So it has no worth basically as a theory, as like a scientific theory. And that was kind of the issue and why they changed it from global warming to climate change, because global warming was more of a testable theory. Like, was the world getting hotter in proportion to carbon emissions, right? Or other things that damage the atmosphere. But that wasn't really fitting the narrative, so they just changed it to climate change. And now if anything happens, Like any storm happens because there were no storms before carbon emissions, they attribute it to climate change. So that's kind of my thoughts on the matter. Now, the question I've always had, and why my kind of opinion on this, I guess, is a bit mixed, is does it ultimately really matter whether or not there's anthropomorphic global warming? Does that really change how we should behave, how we should act towards the environment? And to a certain extent, I would say no. I think regardless of whether or not global warming is a thing, reducing dependence upon and emissions from fossil fuels is inherently a good idea because they cause all kinds of other damage to the environment, which is measurable. Things like smog, soot, radioactivity from coal fire plants, digging up the land, oil spills, they're devastating to the environment for other reasons. So I think there's the general political instability caused by all the various countries of the world kind of competing over oil resources. So I do think there is a big reason to try to move away from them it's kind of irrelevant, that the goals are kind of the same. Another thing that kind of makes me doubt global warming as the anthropomorphic is that it's really the only type of pollution that the developed world produces in higher amounts than the developing world. Like if you go and look at a developed country like Canada or even the US, it's much, much, much cleaner than a place like India, for instance. Like there's a proper sewage system, there's sewage treatment, there's storm drains. There might be some garbage in the city, but nowhere near as much. You don't have people just going out and chopping down trees. Like one of the things is in a lot of developing countries or third world countries, the people don't really have widespread access to coal or oil. So the main form of heating and electricity is from wood or other underbrush. And with a post-medical revolution population, a lot of African countries have destroyed something like 90% of their forests in like a 40-year period. That's how rapid they've just annihilated it. But they, generally speaking, don't really care about it that much. They care about McDonald's and the Amazon, but they don't really care about that because the total amount of carbon emissions isn't as much. They don't care about like toxic waste. They don't care about garbage. They don't care about desertification. I mean, they might mention these things in passing, but the chemicals and stuff put out by the third world is viewed as being secondary at best and tertiary at worst. Meanwhile, in like Canada and stuff, we've made immense strides to clean up the environment, to stop polluting nearly as much, and to preserve more and more land. But a lot of the countries that aren't doing that get a pass. And I think that just comes down to a political agenda that they just hate the West and they hate. It comes down to just a socio-political agenda rather than anything actually to do with greenhouse gases. There's also the issue where whenever these people take power, they don't really take meaningful action on it. I mean, they promote wind and solar, but if they actually believed the world was going to blow up in 5 years, they would like send in the army to like blow up coal plants and like ban cars and all this other stuff. And the fact that whenever they get to come into power, they don't actually do anything meaningful about it, I think is another indication that they're not really serious about any of these things. I mean, the vast majority of supposed climate change programs involve the developed world giving money to Africa and like the Middle East and stuff like that. That seems to be the focus more than any sort of actual environmental solutions. So that's another thing that makes me doubt it. Note that none of these things are really scientific, I suppose you could say, in nature, but I'm a social scientist, I'm not a hard scientist, so I try to read it from the socio-political factors. Another one that I find interesting is that environmentalists are against all forms of electricity. There's a book, The Ethical Case for Fossil Fuels, and the last chapter is about the potential for fusion power, and environmentalists are just completely against it because they say it won't punish humanity for creating civilization. They're like, the idea that humanity could have an unlimited, clean, cheap form of electricity that doesn't destroy the environment basically makes us, the trope, a karma Houdini. It makes humanity a karma Houdini, and it's the worstest thing that could possibly happen. But if you think about it, is there any form of electricity environmentalists support? Do they support wind power? No, because it kills birds, and I've like heard things that it causes cancer or it causes like internal bleeding or something like that. They're against solar power because it might harm the ecology of the desert. Yeah, seriously. They're against hydro because it diverts rivers. They're against nuclear because of reasons that don't really make sense. They're against biomass. There's no form of electricity that they support. They never really offer solutions to any of this, with the exception of deindustrializing or going back to like pre-industrial civilization. Essentially, they aren't interested really in solutions for any of this. And once again, you have to look at someone's behavior, and if they aren't really willing to support things that would solve the issue that they claim to care so much about, you really got to wonder whether or not they actually care about it, or the whole thing is just, like I said, smoke and mirrors to pursue a socio-political agenda that has nothing to do with what they claim it is. And just if you look at the map in front of me, a lot of the countries they complain the most about actually already get most of their electricity from renewable sources, mostly hydro. So once again, we ask the question, does any of this really matter? And to a certain extent, I don't think so. I think moving away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy is a good idea. One of the issues, though, and this is once again where we get into the nature where this thing is so political, it's very hard to have any kind of scientific or realistic position on it, is renewable energy actually renewable energy? Because you hear like it takes more energy to put up a windmill than it actually generates, but I've seen other sources that say over the lifespan of the turbine, it'll generate 30 times or more the amount of energy that was needed to build and put up the turbine. So, I mean, which is it? Because in one case, it's a horrible idea. In the other case, it's a worthwhile investment. So, I mean, realistically, who can you believe on this issue? And it's not entirely clear. So, for the sake of argument, let's just say renewable energy sources in general produce more electricity and more energy than they take to put up. Fair enough. So, we're going to go with that. So, my issue with renewable energy is as follows. I think we're seeing it advance so rapidly, it's difficult to really justify building that much of it at the moment. Because who knows, the power generation efficiency might just get more and more and more and more so rapidly, it's not really worth the time and effort of putting it up. So it's kind of a question of build now or build later, because there's advantages to disadvantages to both. Because if you build now, it immediately starts reducing reliance on fossil fuels. But if you build later, you'll have more money and resources to build the better version of stuff. And I think the technology is just advancing very rapidly, and new stuff is becoming available all the time. So I think even if it's not viable at the moment, it probably will be within the foreseeable future. Now, the biggest challenge I think renewable energy has is storage. And I think that's the biggest issue with switching from a fossil fuel economy to an electric economy, which I think is preferable. And it would be nice if eventually we could get rid of most fossil fuel usage other than industrial things. Even if we could make some kind of safer synthetics for that, that would be nice. But if we could convert cars and stuff over to electricity. The issue is energy storage. Lithium-ion batteries are expensive, and I don't think they store enough for like a national level. Because an issue we have in Ontario, which invested very, very heavily in renewable energy, is windmills perform better at night and better in the winter. And you'd think winter would have high consumption of electricity, but a lot of heating is done through gas and oil and that kind of thing. So my understanding is electricity consumption is actually lower in the winter and higher in the summer because of air conditioning and fans and stuff like that. So we built these huge number of turbines, and they generate electricity mostly in the winter and at night when Ontario doesn't need it. So we wind up selling the energy to Quebec and America for pennies on the dollar. So it's been a complete financial boondoggle. Now, was installing renewable energy necessarily a bad idea? No. But because we don't have an efficient way to store it, it just goes to complete waste. If we did have an efficient storage system, you could recharge it overnight and then use it during the day, and that would be great. That would solve a lot of the shortcomings of it. Also, there's the issue with things like solar power and wind depend upon natural phenomena. It depends how hard the wind's blowing and or how bright the sun is shining. And if you were able to come up with a really good storage system, you could kind of balance it out where it recharges when these resources are high and it lets it out when the resources are low. Same thing with excessive hydro power and excessive nuclear power. Now, we do have things like that with reservoirs where in France, which has the highest proportion, I believe, of nuclear power on Earth, they store the power by pumping water up into these huge reservoirs and then letting it out to generate hydro. And that just always sounds to me like that's very inefficient. And I don't know if everyone has the water capacity for it or the space for that. I don't know. I just kind of feel like it would be a better idea if we could develop some sort of fairly compact battery that doesn't take as many rare materials to build. So I don't know how plausible that is, but I think that is the single biggest thing standing in the way of renewable energy. So let's kind of start putting everything together, shall we? So I think if we don't have the technology now, we'll have it in the foreseeable future. I think a big issue, because I used to subscribe to Popular Science for years and years and years, and the global energy crisis was literally solved on a monthly basis. Like, there were people who developed solar panels that you could paint onto stuff that didn't require rare earth materials or something, and they could have easily just painted it onto highways or onto the roof of cars or the roof of buildings. There's all these efficiency enhancements that they could put into cars that would make them way more efficient without actually losing any performance or anything. There's all this kind of fascinating stuff, organic waste disposal to create biofuels, and none of it ever really seems to get implemented on a large scale. And it really makes me wonder, is it that the technology is not there, or is it that the political will isn't there? And once again, this makes me question how real these things are, because environmentalists don't immediately embrace these things and go, oh, here is a plausible solution to our problem. Let's try and solve this. I do think if the world were to just put its back into it and just invest very heavily in research and development and converting the world's economies, you probably could get to a renewable electricity-based economy in a couple decades. I don't really think there's a lack of technical and economic capacity to do these things. I get that people are saying that there's a lack of rare earth materials and it's difficult to build these things, but we found ways around that sort of thing before. I'm sure there's ways to build these things a lot cheaper and more efficiently. I think a lot of these technologies are very new and very underdeveloped. So I think you probably could. I think there's really three things that need to happen. The first is building more renewable energy, also investing in things like fusion power, nuclear power, and thorium power. Thorium power, maybe we'll talk about another time, but it's it's kind of a newer version of nuclear power that is more efficient, less likely to spread proliferation, is a lot safer, and there's more fuel for it. So investing in those sorts of things, figuring out a way to have really large-scale energy storage, be it batteries or something else, that can be used to even out the unreliable nature of renewable energy. And the third one is just energy efficiency, which I think we've only kind of grasped just a bit of the low-hanging fruit. I think if we wanted to, we could make things way more efficient in terms of lighting, in terms of phantom power, in terms of insulation. I kind of feel the sky's the limit with how much we could reduce individual energy consumption, and kind of gradually reduce the demand. Actually, an issue we had in Ontario is we were so successful at reducing energy consumption, they had to dramatically increase electricity prices to keep the power companies solvent. And just kind of negative incentives for that kind of thing is just something that we're going to have to come up with ways around at some point. So I think a combination of those three things could, in the long run, or not even the long run, I think in a couple decades could basically solve this whole problem. But the question is, can we do that? And the answer, I think, is resounding, with the exception of a couple countries, which I think Japan and some of the other ones will eventually just do that. Japan doesn't have a lot of renewables at the moment, but they have the political will, technical capacity, and I think focus that they could achieve these things fairly rapidly. Is, as a society, because we live in a society, that's not the goal anymore. The goal isn't building things, it's not solving problems, it's not inventing things. If you look at it, to me, I think one of the biggest ones is space exploration. If you look back at the kind of like science fiction and stuff that was written in the 50s, 60s, 70s, it was all about humanity expanding beyond the Earth, colonizing new planets, inventing fusion reactors and teleportation and like Star Trek stuff. And all this like this sense of hope for the future and the sense of there's nothing we couldn't achieve together. But it was very grand in scale, and the Victorian era was a lot like this too. And now we suffer from what I like to call a poverty of ambition. We're not really interested in space exploration. We're not interested in exploring the ocean. We're not interested in any of these like fundamental scientific questions. We're interested in equality, whatever that means. Like the scientific Manhattan Project is to allow men to have babies. It's not to solve the energy crisis. It's to figure out like an equitable redistribution formula for reparations. It's for just all this like useless stuff. It's just, that is the focus. That's where we want to put our money, is in Gives Me That, in like diversity programs and that kind of thing. If you look at like how much money NASA gets, like they got rid of the space shuttle program. You're telling me that they couldn't have just taken a couple $1 billion from some worthless side project and let NASA continue to explore outer space? No, but they won't do that. They won't do that. They won't fund science. The amount of money they give for science funding pales in comparison to things like the military, in America at least. In Canada, it's very different. In a lot of Western countries, it's different. But the money just goes into that, into welfare programs, etc. And that's kind of the goal. The goal is like calculating how many gender identities there are and how much each one deserves to get of the country's wealth. It's about identifying how many different ways we can apologize for various imagined crimes. That's the goal of our society now. That is the height of our ambition, is stuff like that, is stuff like the refugee crisis. We don't have any of these big ideas, these big-brained ideas anymore about trying to colonize the stars and do all this other stuff. It's really sad, to be perfectly honest. So that's kind of where we are. And people talk about peak oil and peak coal and peak nuclear, and I don't think these things are real problems. I think if we're going to be finished off, it's going to be from socio-cultural economic issues long before we run out of oil. I think it's going to be from low birth rates or mass migration or societal, like, cultural collapse or deindustrialization. I think these things are all much bigger problems. I think we have to worry at the moment about the short term and medium term before we can even worry about being finished off by the long term. So while I would certainly like to deal with all of these issues, and I think they are probably issues in the long term, I think at the moment they're just not that important. And that before we reach peak oil or we have an oil crisis, you're going to have so many other issues that, who knows, oil consumption might just fall dramatically on its own account. Anyways, those are my thoughts on the matter. If people like this, leave a like, subscribe, turn on notifications, share the video. As always, God bless you all. This is Argent. We must dissent.